Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for making time today to attend this webinar. This is the mid-year State of the Association report from AIA Minnesota. With all that's happened since the State of the Association report to the membership in November of 2019, and the big changes that are ahead for the association for the rest of this year, we felt it important to, excuse me, to gather the membership to provide a mid-year report on the state of the association. This mid-year report is extraordinary. To our knowledge, the association has never done this before, but these are extraordinary times, and I expect that we'll look back at 2020 as a pivotal year in the history of our nation and the history of the AIA in Minnesota and nationally. We want to give special thanks to the sponsors of today's report to the membership: Kraus Anderson Construction, Pat Clad Peterson Aluminum, and Emmanuelson POTUS. We so appreciate your support of the architecture community and of AIA Minnesota as an organization. Thank you. One other note before we begin, there's so much that we need to talk about today, even more than we anticipated a couple of weeks ago, that we won't be able to do live Q&A within the time that we've allotted. So we encourage you to write your questions in the Q&A box on the screen, and we will send responses to the questions you pose after this session within a day. To all who are attending. So I wanted to start off with focusing on our mission, the reason why this association exists. And it is to advance a vital profession, vibrant communities, and architecture that endures. The context of our work toward this mission has really changed dramatically in the past few weeks and the last 6 months. We have been responding, I hope you've seen, with increased effort. We've navigated a lot of challenges to date, but overall we are relentlessly pursuing relevance and impact in all that we're doing. We are asking how we as an association, as a community, can be collaborative, creative, and adaptive. And we are committed to the vitality of this profession and to helping create the best of what the built environment can be. On the call today, I know we have a lot of AIA Minnesota members. Thank you for joining us. We have partners, our sponsors, exhibitors, and advertisers. We're grateful that you're here, and we are asking for your continued support of the association and your increased engagement in our work. Next slide. I think it's important to start today by addressing the fact that 2 weeks ago, George Floyd was murdered. The 8 minutes and 46 seconds of police brutality, of complete inhumanity that led to his death, spurred thousands of Minnesotans to protest and resulted in nearly 500 buildings being damaged or destroyed. Next slide. I was one of those who protested for justice for Jamar Clark and Philando Castile. And I am very pained that those peaceful protests did not result in the changes that we were calling for. That it took the brutal death of George Floyd and mass destruction of the built environment for many to say never again, and to recognize the need for systemic change, and to express personal and organizational responsibility for supporting what has been, and to commit to creating a new and better future for our communities. Creating that new and better future for Lake Street, West Broadway, Penn Avenue, University Avenue, and other affected areas of the Twin Cities has to be an effort that's led by the communities that have been most affected by systemic racism and the destruction of properties on these streets. If we continue with business as usual, if business as usual is what prevails, we will have failed the moment. And if white people take the lead in community engagement, visioning, and designing what's next for these areas of the city, we will have failed the moment. AIA Minnesota is working to embody this intention. I want to note that there are members of ours and members of the architecture community in Minnesota who have been deeply and directly affected by the events of the last 2 weeks. Next slide. Wynn Architects studio was one of the spaces that was destroyed. We are in touch with Tan and working with him to determine what needs their firm has. And we will be in touch with more details once Tan and I have a chance to connect by phone later today, most likely. I do anticipate that their firm has space needs. And so again, we will try to determine exactly what those are and reach back out to the membership to provide support. Also, another firm that was affected by the events of the last 2 weeks is Mobilized Design and Architecture, based out of North Minneapolis, right above Juxtaposition Arts, that experienced some damage. Our understanding from connecting with Lissa Washington, the president of MSP AOA NOMA, is that the technical the technical issues they were running into late last week related to their servers and the damage to the building are being rectified. They will be in touch with MSP AOA NOMA and us regarding next steps that can be of help to their firm. Next slide. There are also a number of properties that our members have been deep partners in designing and creating. One of them is McGizzy Communications, which was designed by one of our members, Samuel Beckson. They are working on recovery efforts. There is a GoFundMe for McGizzy Communications and a GoFundMe for Wynn Architects. And we encourage you, as you are able, to donate toward those recovery efforts and more broadly. In terms of recovery efforts, I want to note that we are working in collaboration with MSP AOA NOMA. There was a call that we held this past Friday to hear from individuals and organizations that have been directly impacted and to start to determine the variety of resources that this architecture community has to bring to bear in support of recovery for the near term and supporting community-led, NOMA-led envisioning, envisioning, design, and building efforts in the weeks, months, and years to come. So know that we are active, we are connected to community organizations, we are working with those community organizations that are on the ground to develop an approach for matching volunteers to needs. But we are doing that in collaboration with MSP AOA NOMA. Next slide. I also want to note that NOMA National has reached out to us and brought forward the statement that AIA Minnesota, AIA Minneapolis, AIA St. Paul, and AIA Northern Minnesota chapter leaders put together in response to the murder of George Floyd and the destruction that followed. Because of NOMA National, that statement was shared nationally through Architects Newspaper, World Architects, and Dezeen. There will also likely be columns from James Garrett Jr., Lissa Washington, and Samuel Beckson that run in Architects newspaper during the next few days. So we're grateful to NOMA National for reaching out to us, and we will share those columns as they appear. Next slide. You've also seen many of our members and members of this broader architecture community highlighted in the local press and the national press. I wanted to bring forward this quote from James Garrett Jr. that ran in the New York Times, because I think this really is the galvanizing challenge for us as an architecture community and as an organization. That the challenge for us is, how do we not just replace what was lost, but create a more equitable, resilient community? Next slide. It reminded me that a couple of years ago, we brought forward a generative agenda item at a meeting of the AIA Minnesota Board of Directors, and asked, what if we consider the underrepresentation of women and people of color a state of emergency for the profession? What will we do and do differently with that mindset? And that conversation really was galvanizing in informing the financial, the budgetary decisions we made, where we put our staff efforts, and it led to significant development of relationships and new programs toward this end. Going forward, the next generative question to add to the first is, what if we consider systemic racism related to the built environment a state of emergency for the profession? What will we do and do differently with that mindset? Again, I want to, next slide please, speak to our collaboration with MSP AOA NOMA. MSP AOA NOMA is an all-volunteer organization. They do not have their own staff, and we have long been partnered with this local chapter of NOMA in their efforts, in their founding, and on an ongoing basis. Together, we are identifying the needs of architects and designers that have been most impacted. We are organizing the community in response. And we're ensuring that visioning, design, and construction of what comes next is driven by members of the most affected communities. You may recall that we also have done work over the last few years on a framework called 21st Century Development. And that is a framework that is very much rooted in racial equity as part of what does it mean to create the best in development. We will be looking to leverage the grant dollars we have from the McKnight Foundation to bring that framework forward as a potential resource to these community-led efforts. Next page. In addition to what I mentioned related to NOMA National working with us to bring attention to our local members, we are working with AIA National to share learnings from AIA Minnesota's work on equity, diversity, and inclusion. You may or may not have recognized in the statement that was put forward last week that the AIA Board of Directors has elevated systemic racial injustice to be one of 2 top priorities for the organization, equal to climate action. That statement, that action by the board, I don't think has been very clearly communicated to date. I expect there to be much more communication on this in the weeks to come. Another aspect of response is that we are exploring ways to add more sessions of our Foundations of Intercultural Development program, which we now have received more interest than we can meet at this time. So we do have another session coming up later this summer, and we will be looking to potentially add another within the summer to fall timeframe. We'll also be determining when to hold the Intercultural Leadership Program, our local intensive program that's focused on growing personal and organizational capacity for change. That had been slated for starting in the next few months, but with the pandemic, we had put it on hold, trying to figure out how we could rework that successfully as an online program. We will be looking to do that in winter of 2020, 2021. We are poised to launch the National Intercultural Leadership Program that was supposed to be in person as a 4-day intensive in Minneapolis. That will now be 10 online sessions starting in mid-August. Those who have known that this was in the works at the national level, leaders around the country have been in touch with us over the last 2 weeks, asking if this was going to be happening online, and thankfully we had done a lot to prepare for this. So we are ready to launch this, start promotions within the next couple of weeks. So be on the lookout for that. Next slide, please. Overall, I just want to emphasize that in the near term and the long term, our response has to be collaborative. What got us to where we are is not what's going to get us where we want to go. We're going to need to interrogate and revise the systems and approaches that relate to the built environment and to our architecture community. We do have a strong foundation to work from. Over the last few years, we have built many relationships and partnerships. We've developed a lot of programming. We've done a lot of work as an AIA Minnesota staff team, and we are poised to meet this challenge well. And I think it is worth saying that the nation will be watching how we meet this moment. They're watching now as actions are being taken by the Minneapolis City Council related to policing. We have the opportunity to demonstrate what's possible in creating the best of what the built environment can be, and we cannot fail to do so. Next, I want to turn to the impacts of COVID-19 on our members, our firms, and the broader community, and how AIA Minnesota has responded over the last few months. I know some of you are aware of some of these aspects of our response, but I think it's important for everyone to understand in broad terms, in more complete terms, what we've been doing on your behalf. Next slide. So a lot of our effort has been focused on government relations. We advocated successfully for construction to be deemed essential and did so in cooperation with AGC, the building trades, and ACEC through the Building Jobs Coalition we have long been a part of. We were also successful in advocating for architecture to be deemed essential following that designation of construction as essential. This allowed firms to continue to do work at a time when other states around the country were not able to continue the work of architecture and construction. We were also successful in advocating for an electronic signatures bill that again allowed work to continue and the flow of the industry to remain strong. We've continued to advocate for a significant bonding bill. And we've done so not just in the usual context of it being important for the communities of Minnesota. In this case, it's also an opportunity for stimulus to the building industry and the broader economy. The advocacy we've been doing is in the context of a fiscal environment that continues to worsen for the state and for local governments. And we've been doing so with much reduced access to legislators. So this has been challenging, but important work. Next slide. We've also provided significant input to the state of Minnesota in terms of guidance for reopening. We offered that to be a resource to the state broadly, and they took us up on that offer in the specific context of reopening restaurants and bars. This work has firmly established AIA Minnesota as a valued partner to DEED and DLI. We also developed a related pro bono effort to assist restaurants and bars. We recognize that implementing the guidance from the state is very site specific, and we know that our members can be of help to these entities. We've received few responses so far, mainly because attention has rightly been turned to other issues over the last couple of weeks. But this effort has been very positively received by the association that represents restaurants and bars, including Hospitality Minnesota, and well received by the state of Minnesota. We are also advocating for state and local governments to receive federal funds because of the level of fiscal distress they now find themselves in. So that's important for our communities. It's also important for this architecture industry, because as these state and local governments are fiscally constrained, that will flow through to our industry. Next slide. Along the way, we have also been working hard to ensure that our members have detailed information on the PPP loans, and we've tried to keep you up to date on issues with that rollout. We've even helped members find lenders when their usual bank was not accepting their applications. I just want to note that in Friday's AIA Minnesota all member email, we included changes that were approved by Congress on June 3rd that would be made to the PPP as soon as the president signs that bill. There are more details, there are changes related to what is forgivable and extensions on the time period for PPP. So if you did not see that email, I encourage you to look in your email from Friday. We can also resend it to you upon request. We've also developed a variety of resources for you to rely on along the way. We've compiled examples of firm policies early on related to remote work and closing offices. And we compiled resources from Minnesota, from AIA National, and a variety of other organizations. And we started a new Wednesday weekly email so that members could receive more timely information during this time when there's been so much change and so much need to keep you informed. Next slide. Another major effort that we initiated that has created new partnerships for AIA Minnesota with your clients is something called the Future of Design series. We brought together architects and leaders from other industries to be able to share ideas and concerns related to reworking of various spaces to address COVID-19. So we held 5 different sessions. Actually, we've held 4 to date. The research laboratories session is upcoming. But you can see here the variety of organizations that we partnered with to develop this programming. And they have all expressed interest in continuing to work with us in the future. And that's very much what we had in mind, that this was an opportunity to grow relationships that could be continued as we implement additional efforts in the future. And I'll be talking about those in just a minute. Next slide. A few other efforts related to the pandemic that we undertook. We held 14 different town hall listening sessions with various groups of members, partners, and stakeholders. We shifted all of our committee knowledge community meetings to be virtual and did the same for most of our member and public gatherings. We provided technology and other types of support for MSP AOA NOMA and NOMAS, the student chapter of NOMA, for a virtual portfolio review and for convenings of their membership. We implemented virtual homeowner consultations. We had more interest than we had capacity to fill, and received a very positive response to those virtual consultations. And finally, even though we had to cancel the in-person Home of the Month event, we distributed the event program to past attendees and other target audiences to get the information in front of these audiences to help our members connect with them, and to ensure that our partner vendors and businesses also got in front of those homeowners. Next slide. The next portion of this program is really focused on what's next. We have many upcoming programmatic changes and new efforts that have been necessitated by the impacts of the pandemic. They are many, they are significant, and we are very optimistic about these changes actually growing our value as an organization, but more importantly, the value of architecture to the broader community. Next slide. First, the Conference on Architecture is going to need to shift to virtual. The board made that decision at its last meeting. Next slide. And I want to walk you through why we made that call now, as opposed to waiting to decide until later this summer. First, overall, public health experts are recommending no gatherings of 50 or more people in an indoor space until a vaccine is widely available. And the most optimistic timing we've seen for that is about a year from now. Second, being true to our core values of inclusion and integrity, if we were to hold an in-person conference, even with social distancing and taking great pains for ensuring clean and sanitized spaces, our members and our partners who are more susceptible to severe illness and death from the pandemic would be less likely to participate, less likely to feel welcomed or supported by the organization. There are also the logistical and financial challenges of planning for both an in-person and a potential shift to virtual approach. Shifting to virtual at the last minute would require more staff capacity than we have, and it would also leave us vulnerable to increased penalties from the convention center and the caterer. Finally, we really are looking at this as an opportunity to reimagine aspects of the conference and to make it more impactful to our members. It opens up the potential to engage more of our clients and those partner organizations I mentioned earlier, both within Minnesota and beyond. Next slide. Because of the nature of online meetings and the fatigue that can set in if we were to simply replicate the 4-day, all-day, and into the night conference that we usually run, we will be shifting the conference to actually be in October, 3 Tuesdays in October. When we looked at November dates, everything from the presidential election to Thanksgiving made November a really challenging time to try to do this. So we're moving up the conference to be 3 days, October 13th, 20th, and 27th. Each day will have a different focus in terms of its content. There will be additional sessions offered beyond these themes, but these are the themes that will be driving the content. Focus on design for positive climate impact and environmental justice on October 13th. October 20th, a focus on business and personal resilience. And on October 27th, a focus on the future of design, prioritizing health and equity post-2020. Next slide. Thank you. By attending this conference and encouraging and supporting the attendance of others, you support AIA Minnesota as an organization. You support not only your own professional development, but also that of others. You support the connections among Minnesota's architecture community that we all take great pride in. We support the generation of new ideas and insights. And you support the vendors and businesses who are struggling right now to reach you with their products and services. And very importantly, you support a strong financial future for AIA Minnesota. I'll speak more to that in a few minutes. Sponsors, exhibitors, and advertisers who are on the call, we invite you to attend a Zoom meeting this Friday, June 12th at noon, to talk more about what ideas we have in mind to make sure that you are well served by this virtual conference, that it is a success from your perspective. And an email invitation to that Friday session will be sent to you very soon. Next slide. The next major development that we are accelerating as a result of the pandemic is shifting the magazine to be a digital weekly and annual print publication. Next slide. Those of you who have been following over the last couple of years at the annual conference and in our other communications, we have been working on the Reimagining of Architecture Minnesota magazine for 2 years now. After we polled the membership as part of strategic planning and asked whether you, the membership, wanted to see the magazine focus more on the architecture community or more on the client community and key influencers, the strong majority of members wanted the publication to shift toward clients and key influencers. We held conversations with members at past conferences, and the Architecture Minnesota magazine community has been deeply engaged in this work for the past 2 years. We also engaged consultants at Cull McVoy and its boutique design firm within Cull McVoy called 10,000 Design. They interviewed clients and key influencers to get their responses to the current magazine and their thoughts about what would be most interesting and relevant to them. They also conducted extensive research on competing media outlets and provided recommendations on how we could increase our relevance and our reach. Next slide. From that research, we landed on the following course of action: weekly digital content and an annual print publication. Specifically to the digital weekly, we were moving firmly toward this direction before the pandemic because we believe this will allow for much more timely content to be posted and allow us to be much more responsive to what's happening in our broader community, and that this will result in greater impact for a wider audience. We'll be partnering with Minnesota organizations that share our values and interests on content promotion and creation. Part of how this will be successful is by what is posted in that weekly digital being brought forward to members of other organizations, key influencers sharing it with their networks. So relationships are key to this being successful, and we are well poised for this. Next slide. Regarding the annual print publication, we were initially leaning toward a quarterly print publication to complement the digital weekly. However, once we really analyzed that approach from a resource standpoint, we determined that it would require more staffing than we have right now. And as it is, AIA Minnesota is concerned about our ability to keep our current staffing. With that in mind, we're moving forward with an annual print publication for at least the next 2 years. But the idea of a quarterly publication remains on the table and will be revisited in the future after we've had that 2 years of experience. Next slide. So we also analyzed what it would mean to simply stay the course, especially in the context of the pandemic and its financial impacts on the profession, on our partners, and on AIA Minnesota as an organization. We determined that that was actually financially perilous for the organization. We are already seeing some declines in advertising sales due to our partners in the broader industry being impacted by the pandemic. That is expected to continue into 2021. So the scenario planning that we did around this put that potential negative impact of staying the course at $150,000, which is more than our organization can bear right now. By reducing printing, postage, and design costs in going to a digital weekly and an annual print publication, we're going to be able to reach more people at less cost and at a time when these financial considerations are really important. Next slide. So with all this in mind, the last issue of Architecture Minnesota magazine will be the September-October 2019, I'm sorry, September-October 2020 issue. We are going to be working with current advertisers to transition advertising and sponsored content to the digital weekly and the annual publication. We will do that on a case-by-case basis, working very closely with those advertisers to meet their needs. The directories that have appeared in various issues of Architecture Minnesota magazine will now all appear in the annual publication. And after much research and discussion among the consultants at Cole McVoy, the staff team, Architecture Minnesota Magazine Committee, and the board, the new name and brand mark for the digital weekly and the annual publication will be Enter. Next slide. This is the brand mark that we will be implementing. I think you can see within it, it is intended to be welcoming. It actually cues toward portals within the shape of the N and the shape of the R. Next slide. This is an example of what the print publication would look like, the annual print. You can note that it was originally designed with a quarterly in mind. We had much discussion with Cole McVoy once we started looking at these scenarios for staffing, and we all came to the conclusion that this same approach can work very successfully for an annual publication. Next slide. You will note that this approach, that is our ideal approach, is one that includes a die cut cover that reveals the full cover image on the inside and more information about the publication. Next slide. This die cut approach, this portal approach, is one that can be implemented with a variety of design solutions, and again lends itself well to shifting potentially from an annual to a quarterly over time. Next slide. If our financial projections are not are off in any way, and we need to pull back on the expense that goes toward this annual publication, we have a plan B that is a less expensive approach and does not involve a die cut for the cover. Overall, we think that this approach to a publication can be both of very high quality and really a quality that is designed to be kept, designed to be something referred to often over the course of a year. Next slide. In terms of the content, the research with clients and with competing organizations informed by AIA Minnesota committee members, the Architecture Minnesota committee members and the boards of directors, led us toward these core content pillars for the annual print publication and the digital weekly. An overarching theme of community and 5 content pillars: equity, climate, innovation and futurism, economy and business, and experience and beauty. We will be working with our long-standing design partners at LN Design to develop the design of the digital weekly and its related website. While we've not yet begun that design process, we want to show you some examples of other digital weeklies and dailies that give you an idea of where we're drawing our inspiration. Next. So there are some examples like these that are a little bit more content heavy. Next one. And some approaches are a little bit more, lean more toward photographs. Next. There are also approaches that rely heavily on illustrations. We expect that our approach will be one that integrates both photos and illustrations, as we have long experienced with Architecture Minnesota magazine. Sometimes photos are not the best way to convey a concept related to architecture or the built environment. So we expect, again, a combination of content, photos, and illustrations as part of the digital weekly. Next, please. We also plan to integrate ads and sponsored content similar to how Axios e-newsletters do so, where you see the sponsorship at the top of the digital page, and then later on, as you're scrolling through the content, you see sponsored content within that e-newsletter. This isn't necessarily how it will be designed, but we want to be able to lift up the partners, the sponsors and advertisers within our architecture community, and make sure that they continue to be able to reach you and reach that broader audience that is interested in the built environment. Next. So these are just some rough examples of how that enter brand mark could be paired with a tagline and display in a digital weekly. As you can imagine, this is a major endeavor to get this off the ground, especially in the context of the pandemic and heightened attention and resources being put toward other efforts. Our plan is to utilize the time saved by not publishing a print publication in November, December to get the digital weekly off the ground in January, and for the annual print publication to be released in summer or fall of 2021. Next. There are also some additional shifts to virtual that we want to make you aware of. Next. We will be holding a virtual Homes by Architects tour. This was a difficult decision, but was really driven by key factors related to the pandemic. The potential for a second wave in the fall, the potential that we could create a super spreader event, and much unknown related to the liabilities that relate to that. We're also concerned about being able to get enough volunteers and to be able to ensure the health and safety of those volunteers. Several other home tours have postponed their spring and summer events to be in the fall or have gone virtual to varying degrees. We are working now on developing what a virtual tour will be like and have identified technologies that will help make this happen. We have specifically honed in on virtual tour technologies that allow us to bring attention to products within the homes as part of the virtual homes or virtual tours, and believe that that will be a great way for our partners to be showcased as part of the virtual tour experience. There will also be overarching sponsorships available for the Homes by Architects tour. Next. In the category of ever evolving, we put this slide together yesterday, focused on a virtual annual meeting to be held on Wednesday, December 2nd at noon, at which the election of officers, celebration of volunteer leaders, an update on the state of the association, and opportunities for sponsorship would be available. We are going to need to seek legal clarification on whether we can hold the annual meeting at a time separate from the annual conference because of the way that our governing documents state the annual meeting requirement. So it will either be a virtual annual meeting held separately in early December, or it will be integrated into one of those 3 dates in October. This one you can mark your calendars for, a virtual awards celebration on Friday, December 5th at 4 o'clock. There we will have our awards presentation. We are kicking around some ideas related to moments of joy that we can integrate into the awards presentation, and we very much welcome your ideas to that end. And that virtual awards celebration will also provide opportunities for sponsorship. Next page. Virtual committee and knowledge community meetings and events are going to be our approach at least through December of 2020. We've actually seen increased attendance in the virtual format and from a broader geography. We also are wanting to ensure that vulnerable members and staff are well taken care of until a vaccine is widely available. And we will be creating new opportunities for partners to sponsor many of the regular virtual meetings and events of committees and knowledge communities. Next slide. In terms of the local chapters, we want to speak to how they have been impacted by the pandemic and what is ahead for their efforts. Next slide. The efforts of AIA Minneapolis and St. Paul have shifted to virtual gatherings overall, and will now also focus on support efforts for people and places on and near Lake Street, West Broadway, Penn Avenue, and University Avenue. We also have learned, and this has not yet been widely communicated, that Doors Open Minneapolis has been canceled for 2020. What is continuing is the AIA Minneapolis golf event benefiting the Minnesota Architectural Foundation. That will be held as planned, but modified for physical distancing. Next slide. For the AIA Northern Minnesota chapter, discussions will continue related to a potential Doors Open Duluth Superior event in 2020. And I will also be bringing forward the question to that chapter of how we can best support the centennial commemoration of the 1920 lynching of 3 Black men in Duluth. That commemorative event has been delayed because of the pandemic until 2021. The AIA Northern Minnesota golf event that raises dollars for scholarships will be held as planned, and again, modified for physical distancing. Overall, the annual meetings of the local chapters will need to be virtual in nature. Next slide. Very importantly, the Minnesota Architectural Foundation has developed a new program that we are announcing today that will support those who are pursuing licensure. Next slide. The MAF recognizes that this is a unique time of need for students and recent graduates whose internships have been canceled, who have not been able to secure jobs, or have been furloughed or laid off. This new program will provide financial support for ARE study materials for those who've been furloughed or laid off, as well as recent graduates who've been unable to find a job. Initial funding of $12,000 from the MAF has been designated for distribution. This will mean that about 20 to 25 individuals will be able to receive $500 to $600 for online subscription materials such as Black Spectacles or for books. That funding in the context of online subscriptions would be available for up to 6 months. Additional donations to the MAF are welcomed to support this and other MAF efforts. The application will be available by the end of this week and will be due in late June. The goal is to start providing this support on July 1st in sync with the Black Spectacles subscription calendar. Next slide. Very briefly, I want to touch on the regular activities that have been continuing and the strategic efforts that have slowed or paused and new collaborations that have been added during this time. Next. All that we've always done has essentially continued. The only event of AIA Minnesota's that has been canceled is the Home of the Month event, and that was reworked, as I mentioned earlier, to still provide value. And the fact is that the outcomes of that event, the actual Home of the Month articles in the Star Tribune, have continued. Next slide. A number of our strategic efforts have slowed or paused because of the pandemic. The Center for Architecture, the Culture Change Initiative, our local intercultural leadership program, the National Intercultural Development Program, and the review and revision of our awards programs. All of these have slowed to varying degrees, but we continue to move forward with these efforts. Next slide. Two new collaborations we want to make you aware of are a collaboration with Minnesota Brownfields. We had been talking with them about pursuing a Bush grant for visioning assistance for neighborhoods and communities that have brownfield sites in the Twin Cities metro and in greater Minnesota. Our collaboration with them is now becoming, in the near term, focused on the affected areas of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So more to come there. We also have a new collaboration with the Center for Transformative Urban Design, led by Paul Bachnight. The Minnesota Architectural Foundation is the fiscal agent for this new nonprofit and is focused on introducing architecture and design to youth in the Twin Cities, working through the schools and park and rec programs, and bringing broader attention to equity in the built environment. Paul has been a strong collaborator and advocate for the 21st century development framework, in particular the equity elements of that framework. Next. Finally, we need to touch on the financial uncertainty that the pandemic has created for AIA Minnesota as an organization. There are a number of actions that we've taken and more that are anticipated. Next slide. I first want to orient you to where AIA Minnesota gets its revenue. As you can see here, 25% comes from member dues, 11% from firm assessments, and then a wide array of other revenue sources are very reliant on in-person gatherings of our members or of the broader community. 14% of our revenue comes from conference registrations. Exhibitors, sponsors, and advertisers make up another significant portion of the revenue that we receive related to the conference. Not being able to hold a conference in person puts basically, a third of the organization's revenues in significant jeopardy. The Homes by Architects Tour is an event that is unlikely to bring in the same level of net revenue. Our advertising in the magazine, as I mentioned, is down. So virtually every aspect of our revenue picture is either marginally or deeply affected by the pandemic. Next slide. We are already seeing reduced revenue in advertising, exhibiting, and sponsorship. We anticipate a loss of net revenue of 50% or more from the Homes by Architects Tour. As I mentioned, significant reduced revenue is anticipated from the annual conference, primarily because of no exhibit hall, and all of our other revenue streams face risks. Next slide. In terms of the local chapters, risks to their revenue streams are similar but much less severe, due to the fact that the local chapters do not have their own staff and they don't have significant overhead costs. Regular fundraising events related to the annual conference could be negatively impacted with this shift to virtual. So the Minnesota Architectural Foundation is bracing for a year where the fundraising that makes its work possible will also be reduced. And donations to the MAF are also expected to be impacted because of the personal and firm impact of the pandemic. Next. And in all of this, AIA Minnesota as a 501c6 organization has very, very limited options, actually more limited than virtually any other kind of organization. Sole proprietorships have more options for financing than 501c6s. We are currently ineligible for the PPP program. We have been advocating at the federal level for inclusion, but that has been elusive. This would provide a $190,000 forgivable loan to AIA Minnesota. Our last hope on this front is the congressional action expected in July. We have been discussing a line of credit with our bank, but we can't move forward with that until PPP eligibility is determined, because a line of credit could jeopardize our PPP. Same with the payroll tax credit. We are eligible for that. That is provides much less financial support, but we also would be ineligible if we get a PPP. And we explored other options as well. They are not available to C6s. I am grateful for the fact that all local chapters have offered to provide financial support to AIA Minnesota as needed. Next slide. In terms of the financial actions we have taken to date, our driving goals have been to first ensure that the organization survived the pandemic and the related fiscal fallout, and second, to retain our 9-person staff team that serves the state and local chapters and the MAF. As I think you've seen from this presentation and from your own experience, we are more than busy. We are overwhelmed with work and stretched very, very thin with the 9-person staff team we have. We have taken some actions to try to mitigate financial losses. We have eliminated all staff salary increases that were budgeted for 2020 and frozen our salaries. The contributions to the retirement plan accounts for all staff were paused in May following our cash flow analysis. More broadly, we eliminated all staff and board member travel, canceled several contracts, and reduced spending in almost every area of our operations. We moved around our investments to reduce our risk and to ensure our reserves could be preserved. And we are working with a 2-year modeling tool to forecast scenarios. That 2-year modeling tool will soon be available. If that's something that your firm might be interested in, we can make that available to you as well. We'll provide more information on that soon. Next. This is a snapshot of that modeling tool. I'm realizing that we are at time. I'm not going to go into this in depth. It just gives you an idea of where you can move sliders to identify different scenarios. And you can see that we're looking at about a $600,000 loss in revenue. That's what we are projecting through the end of 2020. And next slide. This is really the last message and note I have. I hope that you take away from today's report that we are strong in our purpose, in our responsiveness, and our relevance, but we are also fragile financially, and we need you. If you value the work that we're doing to support and strengthen this architecture community and the broader community, if you're wanting to see us do more rather than less, and if you value our staff team, we need you to attend the virtual annual conference and the virtual Homes by Architects tour. And we need you to remain a member and a partner. And we need you to encourage other people to do the same. If you are facing financial hardship, we need you to talk with us because we can reduce or waive your dues. We need this architecture community to stay together, and we don't want anyone left behind. Next slide. As we close out, I want to thank you for your membership. This is your association, and it is only as strong as your support and your engagement. We want to deeply thank the partners and sponsors of this session: Kraus Anderson Construction, Packlad Peterson Aluminum, and Emanuelson Potus Consulting Engineers. You are valued collaborators in the work of architecture. We can't do what we're doing without you. Final note, for those who posted questions, we promise to get back to you very quickly after this session. Thank you for your patience. Thanks for staying with us these last couple of minutes and for attending. We appreciate you and look forward to talking to you soon again.